Okay, cool. Okay, so we're just going to kind of use this one. Again, this is from this week, not last week. So we're just going to use this just to wrap up the last bit of audio coding. And then from here onwards, we're going to move on to other stuff, video and photos and all that kind of stuff. So now that we know a bit about psychoacoustics, how do the actual audio codecs themselves work? Now, just to point out the sort of cultural impact of this stuff, MP3, you probably aren't so aware of it. I mean, obviously MP3 is a known format and everybody knows what it is by now, but it was a huge cultural thing that happened in the late 90s. It was massive. Like, there was all this, you know, like AI is now, and no one can shut up about AI. That was MP3 back in this day. And yeah, one of the only search terms that's ever surpassed the term sex in search terms, like search engines. So you can, obviously that means it's massive, right? And that was kind of crazy because being able to encode this stuff and share it around and sort of having this democratized information thing happening, we're quite used to it now, and it seems like a natural thing that everyone's always been able to do. But if you think about what happened in the past, if I wanted to pirate something, if I wanted to share something with someone, I had to get some good, like actual hardcore equipment. It was hard to do. Like if I got like a new tape and I wanted to share a tape with someone, I'd have to tape it. And you always lose a bit of quality there, so it was always a bit sort of crappy. So yes, you might be pirating, but like 6 or 7 copies down the road, it sounds like shit anyway. That kind of sucks. And then obviously CD kind of changed that a bit. People being able to burn CDs was a thing, obviously. There was some very loose copy protection around that. And there was also a drama, like people used to get upset about that happening. But the whole MP3 thing means that you don't even have to go anywhere. This was the first time when you could just literally like just grab tons and tons of music and essentially pirate stuff without having to go anywhere or do anything. You just, you know, people were using LimeWire and something called Kazaa Kazaa used to be the one. And you'd get some viruses as well as your music, but that was just all part of the fun. And it was interesting. Like, it was an interesting time. It was a real shift in how music and the music industry worked. One of the interesting things about it is the fact that it killed these megastars. Like, if you think about what we used to have in music, we had the Beatles. We had, like, huge stuff. And they kind of don't so much exist anymore. I mean, we do have big artists, don't get me wrong, and I guess there's obviously Swiftie, and she does a pretty good trade. But, you know, before, you used to have these big megastars, and now, in order to do that megastar thing, they have to tour a lot. So we've really moved from album sales to touring as the way in which people become big. And obviously, it goes without saying, really, that the fact that MP3 came about and it was acceptable, like it was an adopted thing, means that we now have things like streaming, which has got its pros and cons. The other thing about it was great, though, is that all of this stuff was really democratized. Like, as a small band, if you wanted to get music to people, you used to have to do tapes and you used to have to do CDs if you were lucky enough to have all that gear. Obviously, CDs became cheap, and that was quite good. But it was still, like, you know, it was a real issue trying to get music to people. And then after compressed media came along, it was literally just a few seconds of their time, and you can get them something. So it really changed the way that game worked. Now, one of the things that we didn't talk about in that previous lecture there is something about the idea of stereo encoding. So it's a little complex in the way that that works, but if you think about what's happening there, if you've got a WAV file, you've got 2 channels of audio. Those 2 channels are entirely independent. And there's loads of redundancy there. Like, if you think, apart from early stereo recordings, most modern stereo recordings don't actually have that much spatiality to them. Like, they do a bit, but there's also a ton of information that's shared across the 2. And if you think about it, that's a massive place where we could save a lot of data. So MP3 and other coders use that. So there's a couple of different systems that they use. One of them is a mode called stereo joint encoding. And there's a couple of different sub-modes to that, different ways in which you can go about it. You basically mix them to mono, so you take your stereo information, mix it to mono and have a mono copy of it, and then just give some metadata that kind of steers some of the frequencies to the different channels. So you can kind of reproduce some of the spatiality that way, and that's quite good. The other thing you can do is do a mid-side encoding. Mid-side is basically where you have a similar and difference channel. So your mid channel is basically all of the similar audio, and then the side bands are, or the side channel, is everything that's different. So you can kind of use that to code the differences left and right. And then if you don't have much differences, then your side channel becomes smaller and more compressed. So there's a few different ways, and again, MP3 and other codecs are very adaptable. A lot of the time we just press a button and say go, and we just get everything to come out, and we don't really care what those options are, but there's loads of options. You know, in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was entire books that were written about how to encode MP3s properly. So there's a lot of options and stuff to them. We can analyze some of that stuff today. So at the top of an MP3 file, there is a header, and it gives you some information. And this tells your decoder what's about to happen, basically. All the different modes that it needs to look at, what the size of the frames are, and all that kind of stuff. So the frame header looks like this, and we're going to look at one in a minute. I've got some very sort of buggy code that we can run that can look at the header of an MP3 file that we're going to generate in class. So here you can see you've got a sync header, you've got sync bits, basically. And those are there to tell the MP3 file, first and foremost, when the actual audio data starts. So this sync bit here, there's 11 bits, I think, associated with that. And you can basically map in that when the audio data starts. So if you are a decoder and you don't care about any of the stuff in here, you can go straight to the audio data if you want to and just drag it out of a file. So the sync bits tell it where to start, essentially, with the audio data. And that can be important as well because there's something called a CRC, a cyclic redundancy check, that you can do to make sure that your file is in good nick, basically. And it's kind of a way in which you can make sure that you don't have any bit errors as you go through the file. So you can do a cyclic redundancy check, which can be squeezed in here. So it needs to know when the audio data starts, and that's what the sync bits do. Then there's a bunch of other ones. You've got ID and layer, and that is basically the MPEG audio version. We haven't really dived into this too much, but you've basically got MPEG audio 1, and then you've got layers. And MP3 comes from MPEG version 1, layer 3, which is where the audio lives. So MP3 is layer 3. Again, lots of stuff goes into that, but we're kind of glossing over it. The protection bit there is a single bit value. It goes between 0 and 1. If it's a 0, it means that there's a CRC check here, again, for making sure your file's in good condition, doesn't have any errors. And if you put a 1 there, you lose that. And the reason for that, again, is you can make the file smaller. If you're being really, really tight and you need to make sure that that thing is as few bits as possible, you can just get rid of that check. Then you have a bit rate. That gives you 4 bits. These chunks here are bits, by the way, individual ones and zeros. Your bit rate is a 4-bit number that represents a predetermined table of bit rates that you can have for your MP3. Now each of these, this is the frame header, so each of your individual frames of audio will have one of these. So you may have come across variable bit rate, or it's VBR and CBR, isn't it? Bit rate is variable or constant, continuous, something, C, the same. So you can either have it the same all the way through, or you can vary it per frame. You can change that bitrate number, and then the frames of audio will all have a different one. So you can actually vary it as you go through. So if there's parts of your audio where you want to pay a bit more attention, you can put some more bits on that. And if there's areas in the audio where you don't need to, you can pull them back out again. Then you've got the frequency, which is your sample rate. That would be 44.1 typically for an MP3, can be 48K. We already know about that. Then you've got this pad bit. Now the pad bits, basically it sets a 1, I believe, if you've got a weird size frame and you're adding bits in order to fill that up. So if you think about what's happening there, if you've got frames that are coming along and some of them are a bit shorter, well, you'd have to make sure that your decoder is able to make sure it knows when the frames end. And so sometimes it's a bit more reliable just to pad the end of each frame out by a few bits to make sure that it fits a set number and it's the same every time. If you are doing that, you set a 1 in the pad bit. If you're not, you don't, and you have to just write your decoder to make sure it can handle those. That might be where some compatibility comes in, where if you've written a decoder and you can't really be asked to figure that stuff out, you might just say this MP3 player, this MP3 is no good, and bin it off. So it gives you some optionality around that, or tells you which one it's using. Then there's a thing called a private bit, which is used for some specific applications that I know nothing about. Every time I look at this header in lots of different sources, they say it's used for specific applications. I don't know what that means. I think it's a bit that sort of can be used in different ways in different applications, but I've no idea. Then you've got this thing called the mode, which is where you can set whether it's a stereo, a mono, or it's using this thing, joint stereo encoding. So you can set that in there. So that's the mode, it's 2 bits. It's got 4 different options. Then you've got the EX, the mode extension, and that's basically how to handle the mode above. In this, you can do things like encode all of the high frequencies together, because you can't really tell a lot of spatiality in high frequencies. You can do things like you can encode the low frequencies together, because if you think about subwoofers, they don't really need to be anywhere specific. So there's a certain part of the frequency spectrum that we don't need to really care about the spatiality for, so let's just make that mono. And there's a bunch of options that go into there to sort of say whether it's the super high frequencies and the super low frequencies or other things that are going to be joint encoded. Then there's this magic one, the copyright bit, which is literally, is it legal to copy this file? And you can set a bit in there to say, no, please don't. And then it depends on your decoder or your whatever as to whether or not it's going to care about that. You know, I think a lot of programs out there became prolific because they ignored that. Then there's one called home, which is essentially whether or not it's on its original media. So this is obviously, when you're encoding something like this, you're expecting it to be used for legitimate purposes. And so you might have a home bit there that says this is the original media it came from. You could have if you had an MP3 player that was running off of CDs with full of MP3s or something like that, and they were their original media, then you could say, I'm not going to play anything that isn't original. So don't play copies, basically. But again, you're writing these. Whenever you're doing stuff, you're writing these. So you can see how piratable this is. Ignore that and set that to yes. And then you've pirated something. And then lastly, there's something called emphasis. And that is very similar to the phono that we talked about in audio systems last term. So it's essentially where you've got different kind of EQs that are put in place to make sure that you can kind of cancel out some noise. They're very rarely used, apparently, these emphasis bits. But you can basically code whether it's got like a Dolby noise reduction filter on it or something like that and just counteract that filter so it sounds like normal audio again. And then after that, it's a whole chunk of audio data. So each of these are your frames, right? So every time you're looking through your MP3 in order to sort of determine what that thing is, you're obviously only looking at ones and zeros. Using this frame data, the sync bit tells it how long it is, and then it knows where the audio starts and stops. And then you can basically interpret that frame, interpret the next frame, interpret the next frame. Now, it's framed like this. A lot of stuff is done like this in the digital world, because if you think about what you've got to do to seek up and down an MP3 file, that means I don't have to interpret the whole MP3 file before I can sort of move the cursor up and down and sync to different chunks of it. I can just know how big those chunks are and seek to the nearest integer number of those chunks as you go through. So if I want to go halfway through a track, I could drag my seek bar over to that part, and then it will just go, right, that's 400,000 of those or whatever, and then and it will just play it from that point. So that's quite useful. It also allows streaming. They had streaming and web streaming in mind when they came up with this. Chuck each of these frames into an IP packet, and away you go. That's streaming done. So that is MP3. Like I say, it's a very complicated story, but trying to keep it to things that we can actually understand and interact with. Then, shortly after that, we had AAC come along. Is that a question? Go for it. Yeah, we had AAC come along. So AAC coding, you might be familiar with it as it's good. It's got a reputation of being higher quality than MP3. And it's even better quality even at the same bit rate. So MP3 can have a certain bit rate. You could, like I say, you can have a 12:1 compression ratio. You can make things 12 times smaller, and yet AAC will still sound pretty decent at those bit rates. And it's also designed to be something that can code, like, this is the eve of DVD coming along and all that kind of stuff. So we were thinking, right, we might need some more channels, some better options. Let's have a 5.1 version. Let's have a 7.1, all that kind of stuff. So there's more channel and rate options for that. Now, this codec is essentially what made iPods so popular. Not really, because I guess it was the marketing around iPods that made iPods popular, really, isn't it? But iPods were kind of famous at the time for supporting MP3 on this era of MP3 being very popular, but they also supported MP3 and had something better on board. And this is what that is. So AAC is still a perfectly useful, usable codec in the audio world. Now, how does it differ? That's a good question. It basically comes down to a bunch of small tweaks to make things better. So one of the things is it uses a better filter bank system. So as we talked earlier on, I said 34 bands, it's 32. So MP3 uses this 32 band filter. It filters stuff out into individual frequency bands, and then it performs an MDCT to it, which again is to do with chopping things up into frequency bands and assigning bits. AAC doesn't do that. Instead of doing that, it just uses 1024 direct MDCT. So it just goes straight into that MDCT stage, and it does it at a much higher resolution. So you can break your track down into 1024 chunks instead of 32, means you make individual decisions about all of those chunks. Now, obviously, disadvantage of that is it's a lot more intensive to do. It takes more time, takes more CPU cycles. But in the late 90s and the early 2000s, we were just on the era of that really becoming possible. You know, the iPod was popular again because it had a bunch of processing power, and it could do that thing. It could encode or decode, really, AAC. And as a side note, with all of these encoders and decoders, they're designed to be asymmetrical. They take a lot more energy and power and all that to encode them, so that when you get them on a small portable device, they take less time to decode them. So they're designed to be easily decodable, but more hard to encode. And that's essentially what we have as a paradigm that goes right across all of these codec systems. So it uses this direct MDCT filter bank instead of having an FFT section beforehand. The 32 band filter thing was put in for historic reasons, because the way the original, and we don't really study it in this module because there's too much to do really, the way that all the old MPEG audio systems worked used 32 band filters, so it was kind of backwards compatible, so they kept that for that reason. But AAC said, let's chuck that out and let's do something new and more efficient. They also use this thing called temporal noise shaping. So it basically shapes the noise of the bits that are involved with the transient sounds, because one of the big problems you get in MP3 is that things like cymbals and transient sounds sound low bit rate. They sound bad, low bit depth. And so they kind of noise shape away some of that bitty noise that happens around transient signals. So there's a filter that actually actively looks for those signals and gets rid of those. It also has a perceptual noise shaping filter. Again, we talked last year about dither and how we noise shape dither. It's essentially the same thing. So instead of having a bunch of bit noise, which is what MP3 has, you take that bit noise and you try to replace it with a perceptual shaped noise. You push it up into the high frequencies and it gets rid of it, basically. So you push it up into the high frequencies, you can detect it less, and it kind of improves the sound in that way. So there's a few things there. You get this advanced coupling thing, which is where you do that mid-side representation I talked about, where you take the sum and difference channels, but you do it on a per band basis. So instead of just doing it across the whole track like we did before, you do it as a per band basis, and that allows you to dynamically, that side channel with the differences in it is going to get smaller and smaller because you're compressing it per band. And that makes it a bit nicer, and it's also adjustable throughout the track. So where you've got lots of spatial information, you might want to adjust it back a bit and get some of that back, but then really dial it in when you've got hardly anything changing between the channels. And again, it also supports surround channels, and if you think about things like subwoofer channels, you can crank those down in terms of their sample rate quite a bit and get those quite cheap anyway. Oh, thought I had something. Now, one other interesting thing is it uses like prediction models. So one of the big issues you get in audio is obviously if you've got high frequencies, you need to sample at high sample rates. It would be lovely if we could just get rid of that and then kind of reconstruct the high frequencies again. And if you think about what audio has got in it, everything that you've got, all those high frequencies, you don't have instruments up there. They're just harmonics. So, you know, you're not playing guitars at like 16,000 hertz. You're just not. But a bunch of harmonics will be up there, and that adds detail and clarity in what people are actually looking for. So it uses this spectral band replication, which is essentially a mapping model where you say, right, well, this guitar has a fundamental here, and it has harmonics here, here, and here, and here. Let's just keep the first chunk of them, and then we'll use that to predict the higher ones. And so you can basically trim down, you know, 2/3 of the frequency spectrum and use that to kind of re-synthesize it. Kind of clever. There's another similar thing like that happens in engine noises. There's a program called Rev by a company called Crankcase Audio, and they make engine synthesis sounds for games. So you can take an engine, give it a couple of samples, and then it synthesizes the rest of the harmonics that would happen when it's under load or not under load, or where you've got half load or whatever. So it sounds good. So that's quite clever. And then it has a very slightly tweaked Huffman table adaptation as well. So MP3 does use Huffman coding, but it uses 15 set Huffman codebooks, because we gave these examples a couple of weeks ago in Huffman coding where we used like characters, and that was useful to know and see, but it, you know, obviously ones and zeros aren't always like that. And so having a bunch of ones and zeros in different patterns is what we're after. And the MP3 standard pre-codes in 15 of these Huffman codebooks. AAC's just got more of them. So you go through all of them and find the most efficient one, and then you win a bit more on that as well. So these are all small wins over MP3. You know, MP3 was such a big leap, really, that we're only in these kind of areas where we're just sort of cracking through these little small bits. And in doing so, we do make a better codec, and it's a perfectly good one. AAC is actually quite good. But they're only small wins over what we used to have in MP3.